And welcome to Sitehawk's latest educational webinar, EH&S Best Practices Making the Most of Your GHS Data. This presentation will last about 35 to 40 minutes, give or take a few, and if time permitting, we'll answer as many questions we can at the end of the presentation. If at any time during the presentation you have any questions, you'll see a question section on the bottom of your webinar control panel. Please go ahead and enter your questions in there, and we'll aggregate those at the end of the webinar, and like I said, get to as many of those as possible. If we can't get to them today, we'll be sure to answer your questions via email. You'll also see on the top left of the control panel an orange box with a white arrow. You can minimize and expand that using the arrow there if you need. Today, our speakers are Melanie Peden and Scott Williams. Part of Melanie's responsibilities include quality assurance and regulatory review at Sitehawk. She has over 12 years' experience in helping companies of all sizes manage their chemical data. Melanie's experience includes authoring and quality review of MSDSs, performing chemical inventories, and she is also one of Sitehawk's leading experts on regulatory requirements. Scott is the Director of Sales for Sitehawk and has about 20 years' experience in EH&S consulting and management field. With a background in environmental and safety consulting, Scott's role is to advise companies in the evaluation and selection of electronic chemical data management systems. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Melanie and Scott.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, everyone, for taking time out of their day to join us. Hopefully, everyone's able to see the webinar and the PowerPoint that we're going to be presenting from. If not, make sure you send those comments to Scott through the webinar. As he mentioned, we will answer all questions by email that we don't get to in our wrap-up. I do know that a lot of times the Q&A is as important as the actual presentation. So we will make sure we get answers to everyone for questions that are asked. So if something crosses your mind, if we don't know the answer to it or don't have time, we will have an expert in-house review that and send that out in email to everyone. We will scrub the names to protect the innocent, but you will all get copies of all questions and answers. So what we're going to cover today is GHS data, making the most of that and what the aspects and impacts of the change are. We always start this with an overview of what we want to cover. We will want to make a note that we are speaking about U.S. GHS, the recent integration of the UN GHS standard into HazCom 2012. So with that in mind, our outline is as follows. We're going to do a brief GHS review with critical dates. I think it's important because we may have new attendees that are trying to familiarize themselves with what GHS means to them. We will take some time to overview exactly what that is and the significant changes and the critical dates, but that isn't the main focus. The main focus will be really where Melanie weighs in a lot of her expertise in defining the data and the terms. What do they mean? You know, we hear the term, well, we're going to have hazard classifications, or no, H&P statements will be on labels. What does that mean? What do those terms mean, and how do they impact us, and what are the most hazardous ones, or what are the ones that we need to be aware of? Then we're going to spend a few minutes talking about where and how to leverage this data as it becomes more available to the industry and to people out in the field. And then finally, we'll leave you guys with some transition tips. We try to make sure that there's value to these webinars because we appreciate you taking time. It is purely educational, and we learn by some of the questions that get asked as well. So again, we encourage you to throw those to us along the way. With that said, we're going to jump right into what GHS is and the critical dates. So in that part of our presentation, we're going to give a brief overview of GHS, what the significant changes in those critical transition dates. I think those are the most important parts that we can cover in a short amount of time today. Again, as Scott mentioned, we will keep it to less than 45 minutes. And to make sure that we stay on track, we're going to jump through a lot of this pretty quickly. First of all, GHS is defined as a globally harmonized system of classifying and labeling chemicals. This means it's a system, it's a standard, it is not law. The standardized approach that is followed in GHS is to define health and physical and environmental hazards, standardized method for classifying those hazards, and for communicating those hazards in the workplace and beyond. Hopefully the audio is good. Let me know, Scott, if we're getting any comments on audio, because I do seem to hear a little bit of feedback on our end from our system here. Also, note that it's a guide for national chemical safety programs. It's not a regulation. What this means is that our current HazCom standard has not been replaced. It's been supplemented. So what has happened is on March 26th of this year, OSHA adopted into law in the Federal Register the GHS 3rd edition standard into our methods of classifying and meeting HazCom requirements. So the guidelines, the main function stability platform that HazCom is built on hasn't changed. We still require training. We still require communication. We still require material safety data sheets, or as they're going to be called, safety data sheets, written programs. All those elements are there. We just have some more defined and prescriptive ways of defining and understanding what the hazards are on safety data sheets, on labelings, and on labeling methods and things along those lines. So it is truly an international adoption. This slide actually is a little bit dated. It's a graphic, and I'm not savvy enough to update a graphic on my PowerPoint, but we'll have our marketing department get to that soon. It's important to note here in the U.S., Canada is following the lead. There's some recent information out there. We'll talk about that in other webinar series, but Canada will be following the U.S. lead maybe a little bit quicker than was anticipated. We heard 5 to 8 years. It may be a little bit sooner than that, than the U.S. Adoption rates. Mexico published a standard June of last year that says they will accept GHS-related safety data sheets, content, and format. So even though they aren't requiring GHS, they are accepting the format and content. As you can see across the world, Europe has been well into the adoption process. And of course, anyone who does business either from a import or export process understands the global aspect of our economy in today's world. So let me get to the next slide real quickly and talk about what the major changes are. There are really 5 major areas of change. One is the hazard classification, the ways and methods and rules that a material or ingredient substance is now classified by. The MSDS is changing significantly, both from a format and content. Labeling has some very prescriptive requirements now. And of course, communication and training will be modified as a result of this. So I'll touch on the major changes briefly. First and foremost, how will the MSDS change? You guys won't see the M in SDS much longer. They are now SDSs, so it'll be interesting just from a marketing perspective how many companies out there have to adjust their approach. But safety data sheets are now what an MSDS is called. There is a required format and content. Those 16 sections are now required. The classification information on those has certain rules that must be followed and certain information in a certain order. I will make one note as I go to the next slide. You can see the 16 sections that are there. Many of you have seen this over the years in the ANSI format. It's important to note that Section 2 is now hazard identification and Section 3 is composition. Those are the 2 major changes, and the reason for this is that the thought process is that most of the important hazardous information that somebody needs to access immediately will be on the first page or 2 of the document. As you can see, the rest of the sections are fairly similar to what's been there for the ANSI standard that's been adopted by many people over the years. So the SDS changes from MSDS to SDS with required format and content and required classification rules for the hazards, both health, physical, and even environmental, even though environmental isn't regulated under OSHA. You may see those environmental hazards on the safety data sheet. Labeling also changes. You can see in this slide a sample of, for example, an NFPA label, which is often used for workplace labels or even other product labels, for container labels, for emergency responders. And on the right is a GHS label. Other organizations often use HMIS. It's important to note that the new label standards do require the GHS Pictograms, signal words, and H&P statements, as well as supplier information and product identifiers. So those elements are required. Several of them must be located adjoining each other on the label. And it's important to note that you can't have pictograms that are empty or blacked out or covered over or that don't apply. One of the statements in the GHS changes have been added to HazCom, incorporate some specific information on labeling. And there's some guidance coming down the road on how to deal with very small label containers. There are terms being used like reference label and things along those lines that are, again, part of another webinar series that we'll get to in our educational series. From a training perspective, obviously you're still going to have to train employees for hazard communication. We always suggest that you ask a couple questions. What is your timeline? I'll talk about those dates in a minute, but the important one coming up is December 1st of 2013. Your employees will have to be trained on the changes. And more importantly, what changes are required internally on your end for updating your current HazCom program. So those changes revolve around what your employees need to know, because HazCom 2012 has been dubbed the right to understand, but still boils down to the right to know. So how do employees access the SDS or the hazard information? What are the changes to safety data sheets and labeling, i.e. the pictogram definitions, the signal word definitions, which hazard classification categories, statements, or precautionary statements are important to your organization, maybe specifically those most hazardous materials that you already train on. How are the classifications changing, and what do you have to communicate to your employees are important pieces of information that we suggest you look at when you're modifying your training program. So here's the calendar that I alluded to earlier. And again, I'm trying to zip through this so that we stay on track. So important note there, December 1st, 2013 is the first date coming. A little over a year away. All employees have to be trained on both new label and SDS formats. GHS labels will appear on products as well as secondary containers. There is some special provision for shipping labeling, and I'll talk about that in the next completion date after the June 1st of 2015, which is really the major second milestone where compliance with all the modified provisions have to be met. And that compliance means that all safety data sheets in your facility must be GHS compliant. Your product safety data sheets must be GHS compliant. And then by December 1st of that same year, you can't ship products any longer unless they are labeled with the appropriate GHS information. And then by June 1st of 2016, you'll have to update alternative workplace labels and your HazCom program and provide training for the newly identified physical or health hazards. So again, the education starts in 2013 on here's what's coming, here are the changes, here's what you may see. Then by June 1st of 2016, you have to train specifically to what's found in your workplace. It's important to note that during the transition period, you can comply with either standard. And we anticipate this being the case, for example, from a workplace labeling. Many safety data sheets out there today and for the next 12 to 18 or even 36 months will have NFPA and HMIS information on them. Until the manufacturer updates the safety data sheet with GHS information, the ability to print a GHS label will be very difficult unless you're really an expert and understand how to self-classify material, which is a chore in itself. You'll have to continue using the label information. So there may need to be two sets of labeling in your workplace as materials change. Again, that's not an optimal solution, and we don't recommend it. We're obviously working hard as an organization to help companies transition as quickly as possible so that their SDSs are authored properly with the appropriate GHS hazard classification information in Section 2. And then obviously also encouraging vendors to provide GHS compliant safety data sheets where the management of MSDS is occurring. So that takes us really from an overview of the significant changes, keeping in mind it's the SDS itself, the labeling, and then the communication and training, but that all boils around the data and what the classification process is and what those terms mean. So I'm going to kind of step back for a second and let Melanie take really full control, because she is our one of our resident experts on this information. But I do want to make a note and finish before Melanie jumps in by saying, note that every safety data sheet that's out there is going to have to be reauthored or reclassified, meeting the new content and format requirements. So with that, Melanie's going to talk about an understanding of what the terms are, what they mean, kind of give us an overview of the most critical hazard statements. It's something I've been curious to see, what are the categories and the H and P statements that we'll see most often that we need to run away from, I think, as I heard one person say. And then, more importantly, tie it all together for us. How does it all work together? How's it going to be used, and what does it mean? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie, and I'm just going to operate the slideshow, if that's good.
That's fine.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Under the old HazCom, we used hazard determination. So, for example, you might have a material that was a corrosive or an irritant, where with new HazCom, you'll use hazard classification, where you'll not only determine the hazard, but also categorize it to indicate its severity. So where before we had corrosive and irritant, you can see how many categories now correspond with that under the new HazCom. So you'll have, first of all, it's broken out into skin and eye, and then you'll also notice the numbers and letters. Those are categories and subcategories. So you have skin, 1A, 1B, 1C. Those are all different categories. And the severity is different than it was when under NFPA and HMIS. The higher the number, the higher the severity. It's the opposite with new HazCom. Now the lower numbers are the higher severity. So skin, 1A, and the serious eye damage, 1, are the highest hazards listed on this page.
So that's a pretty significant departure from a lot of the current classification outputs that we see from a label perspective even. An NFPA label rating for health of 1 is not so bad, but a rating of 4 is pretty bad, and the opposite occurs now. It's going to be an interesting change in everybody's thought process as they educate out there.
Yes, that's a very important change to be aware of.
So classification means determining the hazard classes and even including, where appropriate, the category per class.
Yes.
Big, significant difference. So tell me again the skin corrosion and 1A. That skin corrosion is the classification, the 1A is the severity.
Together, the hazard class and the category together represent the hazard classification. And the A, B, and C, specifically for corrosion, the determination of which subcategory it falls in is just based on the exposure time.
Thanks, Melanie. Next slide.
Yes, so that was just one example of classifications. This is a list of all of the hazard classifications that you'll see under HazCom. We've broken it down into health and physical. The bold font tells you the hazard class, and then the categories that apply to each are listed underneath. You'll notice that there's different numbers of categories per class. Some have up to 7, while others only have 1. And the ones that are listed in blue text are the ones that OSHA added to their adoption of GHS. And they do not have categories. They're just a single classification. Okay, as I said, OSHA added to GHS. That's something else that's important to note is that while it's supposed to be globally harmonized, each country or agency has the ability to adopt a building block approach where they can adopt what is relevant to them. So U.S., OSHA, we have not adopted the lowest categories for acute toxicity, skin corrosion and irritation, and aspiration. You can see the difference in what UNGHS has available and what OSHA actually adopted. We didn't adopt any of the environmental hazards, and then we added 3 hazards, the simple asphyxiant, pyrophoric gas, and combustible dust. And then we have the kind of the catch-all of hazards not otherwise classified, which anything that's outside of the scope of that previous slide that listed all of the hazard categories that are available would fall into that category.
So are we going to give a definition of that, or can I ask you for an example of a hazard not otherwise classified?
Examples would include a biohazard, frostbite, radioactive. Those are a few.
Okay. Thanks, Melanie.
Okay, so we talked about the classification, and once you have your classification, the next thing that you would need is a pictogram, which is really just a symbol to represent the hazard. The format is a square on point with a red border, and the picture inside is black and white. We've listed here the different hazard classes that are associated with each of the pictograms. We've listed all 9 pictograms here that GHS provides. It's important to note, too, that OSHA adopted 8 of these. We did not adopt the environmental because that is one of the hazard classes that's not covered. Therefore, the pictogram was not adopted.
And that falls under the EPA's purvey, and I do know that they are have a review process going on how they're going to integrate GHS as well.
That's correct.
So you mentioned this a couple times, and I want to touch on that, is while it is a globally harmonized standard, it is a building block approach, and we have adopted most, but not all, and we've also added a few tweaks of our own to the classification rules. Now, it's important because it is a global economy out there to note that, for example, Canada may do the same, and so it's possible that as Canada adopts beyond WMIS, the GHS standard into their WMIS regulations, that a Canadian SDS may not be compliant here in the U.S. unless it has both agency classifications on it. The same thing occurs now with U.S. GHS and EU CLP. There are some differences. There's some differences between EU CLP and the Chinese adoption of GHS. So while it is mainly harmonized, there are some nuances that are important to note so that the classification and information that's being communicated downstream, either on your products to your customers or to your employees, is consistent with the area of the world that you buy and use the product.
That's correct. The building blocks that we showed a minute ago, that was just OSHA's version of building blocks, but EU CLP has their own as well. So that's going to vary from agency to agency, and that is the reason that it's not completely harmonized. Also wanted to point out while we're on this slide with the pictograms, the ones on the top line are probably the ones that you're going to be the most familiar with. Those are the ones you'll see the most, depending on what you do, what chemicals you make. The exclamation mark are used for most of your acute or short-term hazards, and the health hazard,
the Starman, as people call it,
yes, is going to be your chronic or long-term hazards. Okay, so a few other definitions of terms that you're going to see. A signal word is really just a single word to quickly indicate the severity of the hazard. There's only 2. It's either danger or warning, with danger being the more severe. And then
there actually used to be a third that we saw, I think, in ANSI signal words, which was caution. That one's been dropped and isn't included. So if you don't see a signal word, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no hazard. It just means that it is not the severity rating of danger or warning.
Correct. There are classifications that do not have a signal word. And then hazard statement is a specific statement that is associated with a hazard class and category. So it's not always a one-to-one. There are some that share, but it's pretty specific to what your classification is. So here I've listed 2. One's a health and one's physical. The fatal if inhaled, that is specifically for acute toxicity, categories 1 or 2 via inhalation. And flammable liquid and vapor, that is a flammable liquid category 3. And so those are the only places that those would be used. And that's the H statement or H phrase. Your precautionary statement, that's your P phrase or P statement. And that is a phrase describing the measures that should be taken for prevention, response, storage, and disposal of your chemical. Where hazard statements are more of a specific one-to-one statement, precautionary statements are more general and you'll use them for multiple classifications. Here we have listed just the highest level of severity in each of the hazard classes. So this covers all 11 of the health hazard classes, and you can see the relationship between the health hazard statement and the hazard class. So there is your fatal if swallowed is associated directly with acute toxicity oral category 1 and 2. And we've also listed for you here the appendix where it would be found in the HazCom. The column that has the code, that was actually the GHS code, which OSHA did not adopt the code. You'll still probably see them on some SDSs, and that's fine. It's not going to hurt anything. It definitely helps with identification. It's an easy identifier. So that's what those codes are, and you'll notice that since OSHA did not adopt the codes, therefore the hazard statement at the bottom in blue, that is what OSHA added, the simple asphyxiant. So that's their phrase, and it does not have a code since that was added by OSHA.
You mentioned that we may see that on safety data sheets. That is applied on European EU CLP. Does that H code appear on a European? And we would recommend that that code be associated as well because it does help for consistency's sake, but again, it's not required.
One other thing to note on this slide is that most of the phrases are static or fixed, and it's the same regardless. But if you look down at, for example, H372, if you knew that you had a chemical that caused damage to the liver or kidneys via inhalation, then this phrase would state, causes damage to organs, liver, kidney, through prolonged or repeated exposure via inhalation. So it would be, you could make this statement as specific as you know. And similar to the previous slide, this is just the same type where we've listed the most severe hazard statements for each of the physical hazard classes. Notice that the appendix on all of these it starts with a B. It's a separate appendix for physical than for health. Other than that.
All right. Thanks, Melanie. I'll flip on over to the next. I had a little technical issue there. I was trying to get switched.
Okay. So now we're going to look at an example. We've talked about all of the different terms, and sometimes the best way to understand that is to see an actual example. This is a pretty simple one. This chart here is taken from Appendix B6. I just wanted to point out that with all of the changes to become familiar with, it's helpful to know that there's always a reference, and so I tried to use some of the direct content from the regulation so that you have a reference point. Let's say, for example, that I have a chemical that has a flash point of 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So I could look at this chart and see that 100 would be between 73.4 and 140. So I have a Category 3 flammable liquid. That is my hazard classification. So then taking that classification, I could then go to Appendix C and find out the remaining label elements for my hazard communication. So if you look at the line for hazard category 3, you'll see that I have a signal word of warning, my pictogram is a flame, and my hazard statement is flammable liquid and vapor. Those are all pretty simple. Precautionary statements, you'll see there are a lot of those. They can be condensed, they can be combined to simplify or to save space on a label. Also, if you have, this is only for one hazard, most of your materials probably have multiple hazards. You'll need to go through this same process for each of the hazards related to your material. And then some of your precautionary statements you'll need to prioritize based on those hazards, especially for first aid. You might have, you'll see that if you had an acute toxicity hazard and a flammable hazard, those are things that are immediate and you would need first aid, which would be your response statements here. You would need those before you would probably need a response statement for a long-term hazard like carcinogenicity. You'll also see some of these are dynamic as well. There's an ellipsis and some slashes in some of these statements, and all of those, the content that would go in those, are defined for you in Appendix C. There is more complexity to the process that we just went through for classification. If you have a mixture, you would have to evaluate the data of the components, and it would be more difficult than just doing it for a single substance. But those are the basic steps.
Thanks, Melanie.
And these are the label elements, again, taken directly from Appendix C. These are the label elements for the hazard classes that OSHA added to GHS. And I also wanted to point out, mention that some of the classifications don't have any label elements. If it's the lowest classification, for example, organic peroxide type G and self-reactive type G, those have no elements. But all of that is clear, and it's laid out in the appendix.
So that's an overview of the definitions, what the data elements are, and how they work together. And you know, as I think I made mention early on, the process of authoring a document is very complex. But more importantly, once the data and the process occurs throughout the industries, and we have much more GHS compliant information out there, what kind of value will that bring to an organization? You know, and I get asked this question a lot. I have a lot of question marks after it. Can GHS bring more than costs and effort to an organization? So I'll talk a little bit about the benefits. I'll talk about some areas that you can utilize the data, and then we'll wrap up with some transition tips. We're doing pretty well right now. I think we're right spot on where we want to be time-wise. We've got about 15 minutes left, so we should be able to get through this pretty well. One note is the information that Melanie just went over is something that you in the field, if you're an EH&S manager dealing with GHS at the facility level, as opposed to someone who is a product stewardship manager who is concerned with sustainability and authoring their documents, will want to consider. You know, you will have to know if your materials are compliant with the US GHS standard by June 1st of 2015. So by understanding what these elements are and if they're on the safety data sheet, and not only, say, for example, is there an H code or a P code, but does it have the specific target organ effects, you'll get an idea then if it's truly being classified appropriately. And so you'll start to get an idea of the expertise that's out there and whether the document's a valuable document for understanding the hazards of the use of the material or not. So what are the benefits? You know, we get asked, why do we need GHS? And the bottom line is that our world becomes multinational more and more every day, and our importing and exporting of all products and raw materials. Yeah, every country having a different system for communication causes costs and potential liabilities. So even though GHS isn't 100% consistent, it is much more consistent than what's been done in the past, and also gives the guideline and framework that all countries will work towards as they update their internal regulations and agencies. So making systems consistent for the workers handling hazardous chemicals will be one of the positive benefits for this. Long-term reduced costs both to governments and industries. You don't have to understand if the safety data sheet that came from your supplier in Mexico or China has at least a similar classification process for the hazards of that material, so that you can train your employees will reduce time. The ability of communication of the hazards, there's much more information available now as a result of EU having an Annex 6, for example, than there was just a few years back on the hazards of chemical information. The bottom line is, in our industry, protecting workers is an important part of not only OSHA's mission, but the EH&S professional in each industry. And it's been proven over and over again that workers' compensation costs, reducing injuries, and reducing workplace downtime or lost time is a cost saver for an organization. So long-term benefits, include reduction in costs, protection of workers, and better communication. And the simple fact of the matter is to be competitive in the global marketplace, the U.S. had to adopt this. So where will the GHS-related data be of value? Some areas that we tend to forget about are research and development. Understanding the hazards of the ingredients prior to building the greatest new widget, and understanding a specific set of rules that it will be classified by will help potentially save a lot of R&D costs or development costs of a product that's not viable in the market due to regulatory change or due to the hazards of the use of the chemical in the world. One example I always use was a great chemical to have on hand was brake cleaner. Back in the day, you could get grease on your dress slacks and spray it with brake cleaner, and you were good to go. It was gone. Great solvent, but it had, I think, tetrachloroethylene in it or some other methyl ethyl death type solvent that has since gone away, and there's not a lot of that used in brake cleaner any longer that's available. And understanding the hazards of the ingredients prior to developing a new product will help. Training, having a consistent message is always less expensive in the long run. Being able to look at the safety data sheet for one mixture or one substance from one manufacturer and the same product coming from another, and having a good confidence that those safety data sheets are consistent will be of value. And I believe that more accurate information on the hazards of the material will be listed. There's going to be more disclosure as a result of this. To some degree, you still have the trade secret capability to not give away the farm when you're creating a document of your proprietary product, but you do have to assess the material with the hazards of those secret ingredients. And what will happen is you'll see a more level playing field. I believe that manufacturers will have similar information, and so the fact that one player in the industry doesn't disclose fully the information except in a footnote on Section 15 for regulatory with California Prop 65, for example, because of the GHS rules, as enforcement becomes more viable, you'll see a more similar information on SDSs across manufacturers and hopefully somewhat leveling the consumer's playing field. And then finally, long-term reduced risk. Being able to have an idea of the hazards, the pictograms, the signal words, the H&P statements that are important or that are found in the use of the chemicals at your facilities, and being able to use those to reduce the risk by eliminating the ones that are, the most hazardous based on their category or classification will be of value. We want to wrap up with some transition tips, and then we're pretty close to the timeline. If we have questions, we'll try to get to those, but my guess is we're probably going to have to answer as many as we have via email. So let's talk about the transition tips and wrap up with some housekeeping. First and foremost, we recommend that you create a transition plan and that you identify critical impact areas. It's not as bad as the Y-Juice K-scare was. I remember that, although I was really young at the time. But one thing you might want to consider that I haven't heard talked about out there is if you have specialty providers that create an adhesive or a lubricant or a special formulation for part of your process, you need to begin talking to them now about their transition plan to GHS and ensuring that you're going to have a GHS compliant safety data sheet in your hands so that you can be in compliance. The smaller companies that special formulate information for local vendors are going to be the hardest pressed to have the resources to create an author document that's compliant. It's a very complex process. Also, start considering which of your main product lines that you supply SDSs to your customers for are, and make sure that that's included in your transition calendar. And I'll provide a sample of the transition calendar here in the webinar. But know which are your main product lines, the ones that your customer service reps are going to be getting questions on. Hey, is your SDS GHS compliant? You're going to hear that if you haven't already, and start your process of planning for getting your products authored. And I will say this, we feel strongly that there's going to be a bandwidth issue in the authoring services business. There are only, I think, 38 certified by the AIHC authoring certified authors program in the country right now. Those are people who have met the requirements and taken the test to prove that they have the capabilities to author a document in a compliant format. I'm sure that list will grow some, but there are more than 1 million records according to OSHA, and I would be willing to bet there are probably closer to 2 million when it's said and done, documents that have to be authored, re-authored over the next 2.5 years. So the sooner you consider that part of your business and put that into your transition plan, the better. Just at the plant level, perform a chemical inventory. It's a good best management practice no matter what. The fewer chemicals, the fewer the cost, the lower the risk. More importantly, the fewer new SDSs you have to deal with and less hazard assessments you have to undertake, or the less review you have to perform on those materials. 3, conduct training. We've moved that up in our tips because of that's the looming deadline, December 1st of 2013. 4, make sure that throughout the process, either you or your vendor are acquiring and updating SDSs and asking for GHS compliant and noting that they're GHS compliant. If they don't do that, if you have a vendor that's not already planning and already prepared, now is the time to look and find someone who can support you. Then update your labels. Again, you're going to probably deal with 2 labeling systems for workplace labels and product labels over the transition period. But the sooner you can have a system that allows you to generate a GHS compliant label with the information found on Section 1 and 2 of the safety data sheet, the better off you'll be. And then don't forget the maintenance part of this. Melanie corrected me yesterday when we were talking about this. The UN GHS standard gets reviewed and updated every 2 years. OSHA adopted UN GHS version 3. UN GHS version 4 is already out, and that doesn't mean that OSHA will necessarily adopt all changes, but it is important to note that it is an evolving standard like ISO or any of the others working towards continuous improvement. And so the assumption is that long-term, as more information becomes available and more classification information is understood, a more consistent approach is out there, that changes will occur, and this means that SDS changes will occur. So make sure that you have a plan in place and a process that allows you to maintain what you've accomplished in this transition period. So here's a sample. We're about to wrap up of the transition program calendar. We break it down over 3 years. The final rule is done. That inventory has been completed, establishing your training content and training your employees by the end of next year. Go through the process wherever possible of getting the information as quickly as you can from your vendors and maintaining going forward. So just a quick kind of flow chart. We suggest that you add the resources that you need internally, the management buy-in and training, both from an internal and external perspective. And everybody on this call is already taking the good first steps of getting educated on what's going on. Our last few tips from an SDS management perspective, because this is what I know more than best, I think, of all the things that we talk about, is as you're thinking about this, know that you may want to consider taking advantage of the expanded SDS data indexing information. Understand which GHS hazard classifications or pictograms, signal words, and H&P statements are there. Understand that they may vary by country or agency, and you may see 2 or more agencies on a safety data sheet, which ones are applicable to your use in your facility. If you have a system that doesn't index that information or doesn't denote the difference, then it's important to consider finding one that does. It'll make your life much easier in compliance. From an SDS update services, we suggest contacting manufacturers every 2 years, which is our process. And when doing so, ask for a U.S. GHS compliant, not a GHS compliant, but a U.S. GHS compliant SDS, because there is a difference. The third tip is from a GHS labeling. A lot of companies out there offer GHS labeling. The labeling companies are providing GHS label stickers and things along those lines. Our recommendation is to go a step further. The system you have should allow you to, or they should do for you, the indexing of GHS information from Section 2. Pictograms, signal words, H&P statements, and auto-populate that in the label. That way you don't have to worry about different types of pictogram stickers or different types of printers. You should be able to populate that information onto a label from the safety data sheet database. And then finally, for gap analysis, have an audit report, some method of understanding the difference between which materials in your site or your facility are GHS compliant, and not just GHS compliant, but US GHS compliant or Canadian Women's compliant or some other GHS standard, and identify those gaps so that you can contact manufacturers to make sure that they're helping you meet your compliance needs. We've got several links that we are including as a part of the presentation. There are actually some really good pieces of information out there now on the OSHA website. If you haven't seen that, there's a side-by-side comparison of what was the old HazCom and what's the new. And there's a final rule which incorporates all the elements of classification, definitions, and information that Melanie described for us earlier as well. You'll notice the last link is ghsinformation.com. That is a website that we keep up with information on GHS as a public service to people in the industry. Feel free to visit that anytime. As we get updates or aware of information and changes and guidance, we will make sure and publish that out there. With that said, we'll turn it back over to Scott Palabinski. We are right on 45 minutes, so I guess we're going to answer all questions by email, Scott?
Yes, that will work.
Okay. Sorry, guys, that we ran long. I thank you all for your time, and I'll turn it over to you, Scott.
All right, just two little important items of housekeeping. First, let me thank all of you for attending. We hope we provided you with some useful information. Let me also thank Melanie and Scott for presenting today. Also, we will be making the webinar slides and presentation available to you. You should be receiving an email within the next day or so with a link to the recorded webinar where you can also download the slides. With that, we'll wrap it up, and thank you all again.
Have a great day, everyone.